further ado.
All right. All right. So it's exciting to be back here with you guys, like I said earlier in my introduction. And I do think the journey is important. And I think that for you to realize, like, I can stand here today very confidently and say, yes, I went to space and I did blah, blah, blah on my resume. But I also think it's important for you to recognize that along the way, there were important people that were my mentors. There were important people that helped me when things went wrong. Because as you know, not every day is going to be super easy. There's going to be actual problems in your life, whether it's with peers or in family struggles, death. These are real things that happen to each of us through our journey, and it takes all of us working together. So there were setbacks along my way, there were detours, and yet I can now say I did this, but I wouldn't have been able to say I did it when I was your age. And so I'm going to talk about some of the people right here in this district and right here in my family in Fort Collins that helped me get there. So the destination is your big dreams, because you have a lot of big dreams. I had a lot of big dreams sitting in the school classrooms, and they weren't all just about space. Like I talked about, I was a runner, and I was a singer and an artist, and I had lots of dreams in these areas. And you know, I didn't become an Olympic athlete, but I have never once not lined up on a line and been really excited to run that race. And they're hard races to run, as some of the people in this room know about running. So you're going to do stuff, and it may not get the big success, right? I didn't stand on a podium and get a medal for running. And yet I worked with some really awesome teams and learned from those experiences while I was running. So I just want you to think about, like, dreams doesn't mean like that you only have one, and it doesn't also mean that you're going to get the ribbon for every single one, but that each one, I think, is really important in creating you and also shaping you, and later you'll have connections back through those dreams that connect with other people. Okay, so it starts out when I was in 3rd grade, and this is important because in 3rd grade, Sally Ride flew in space. So being that she's the first American woman to go in space, this was a big deal to me. And the same year, the movie The Right Stuff came out. Does anyone even know about this movie? Okay, so a few people know about The Right Stuff. It's a book.
It's actually on the front pedestal as you walk in.
Awesome.
For all of you who might want to check it out on Monday.
I'm a big reader.
In my room, you're welcome to check it out.
It is totally fun. I went and watched it with my daughter when she was in 3rd grade, which was 2 years ago, and I watched it with my parents too again. And they're like, oh, I can't believe how much swearing there is in this movie. And I was like, wait, you let me see it in 3rd grade. So I'm just going to say it's a good movie. It talks about the first 7 Mercury astronauts and how their journey to becoming America's astronauts. And so I saw this movie, and Sally Ride flew in space, and then a little bit later, Catherine Sullivan did this first spacewalk. So about this 1983, 1984 time frame, when I was in the 3rd, 4th grade, my teacher asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, well, I want to be an astronaut, because now girls can be astronauts in America. But I also was reading the Little House on the Prairie books, and my parents were teachers, and like I have a bunch of family members that are teachers, including my cousin who's in this district. And so I wanted to be a teacher. And you know, here in Colorado, I don't know how many of you spend time out in Rocky Mountain National Park or up along the foothills, but I spent a lot of time there, and I love the outdoors, and so I wanted to do something with the outdoors too. So we'll talk about how these dreams that were happening in elementary school kind of came true. But it does start in this district. So I moved from Loveland to Fort Collins in 7th grade, which at that time was junior high. And it was kind of an awkward time to move, but I started to find some friends. And Mr. Jordan was a teacher in the district at Bolts, so I went to Bolts. And Mr. Jordan had an after-school club called Mesa, but then he also had like his normal class. And in our normal class, we did this really cool project. It took several months where we brought in our food waste and we cooked it up, we added yeast, and we essentially made ethanol. So I learned a lot about biology and chemistry and all of these things while stinking up our classroom and then also making a useful product which was able to run his lawnmower. So I thought this was so cool. And Mr. Jordan asked from our Mesa Club, which is all these folks, 2 of us, Terrence and myself, to go to California and present this presentation to other Mesa advisors and other Mesa students. So how cool, I thought, wow, I am an 8th grader, and I know there's some 8th graders in this room. I'm going from Fort Collins all the way to California to go talk about this project. This is the first time I ever even saw myself as a scientist. Until then, I just was like, oh, I'm gonna be a good student. You know, both my parents were teachers, so I can't really get away with not being a good student. And, but this is the first time I saw myself as a scientist. And so Mr. Jordan I would consider as an important mentor that helped me along the way. The next year, I had this opportunity to go to space camp. Originally, I wanted to win the all-expense-paid trip to space camp, but I took 2nd place. So I got a cool t-shirt. At the time, Martin Marietta, which is now Lockheed Martin, Martin Marietta sponsored this all-expense-paid trip, so they gave me the t-shirt. So I wore the t-shirt with pride. But my parents, who I also credit as being huge support for me all through my life, my parents sent me to space camp in April of 1990. In April of 1990, Discovery was taking the Hubble Space Telescope to space. Hubble, you guys know about it? Yeah, everyone knows about it. In fact, we think so much differently about our solar system thanks to Hubble and about our universe. So, and it continues to inspire people and to provide important science to us today. And so the fact that it was going up during this week that I was hanging out with other students, like you're hanging out with students here today, was really important. I came back and I built the model of Discovery and I hung it in my bedroom because, like I talked about, it's really important to have, I think, visual goals. And so this was my visualization of my goal. And now it felt possible. Like by going to space camp, I had met engineers at Marshall Space Flight Center, which is part of NASA. And I had heard from people that had worked in the space industry. So now I started to feel like, wow, this is possible. Just like I hope today and the next few days, you start to think, wow, this isn't so impossible. This is really possible. Okay, so I put that in my bedroom. Sadly, I think it is still in my bedroom. And then I became a high school student. So I went to Fort Collins High School at the old school, like I told you. And I did a lot of different things. And one of the things I enjoyed doing was Science Olympiad. So I heard there's some Science Olympiad members out there. And kudos to you, because it's a lot of fun. I met really cool people I'm still in touch with today through Facebook. And I just had a good time. And Mr. Lunt, who is also a teacher in this district, was my Science Olympiad instructor. So that was super cool. And then as you heard earlier, Mr. Luckison was my calculus teacher as well as my cross-country coach. So my years at Fort Collins High School were, I would say, fun. They were hard. I had a lot of really good, intense classes that prepared me for college, but I met really good friends, and I stay in touch with all of them as well. And they were able to come to my launch, which was super cool. And as well as like all these teachers that were my mentors. So I loved walking the halls of Fort Collins High School, which my grandparents had walked the halls of. So I thought that was neat, that both my grandfather had played football for FCHS, and my grandmother wrote for the newspaper. All right, so I graduated from Fort Collins High School, and I went off to a college in Washington. And this was the first like kind of little detour. At first, I was going to go to the Air Force Academy, and I had all the right plan to go that direction. But at the last minute, I just didn't feel certain about that decision. And so I decided, you know what, I think I really want to go to a liberal arts school, and I feel more like science. And so I applied to Whitman, and Whitman is in Walla Walla, which is out in these wheat fields, now wine fields in eastern Washington. And so it's exactly 1,000 miles pretty much from my door here in Fort Collins to there. And so this was my way of figuring out, like, who am I? I've always been here in Fort Collins as, you know, the daughter of my parents or so-and-so, but who am I as an individual? And at Whitman, my first semester, I took an Intro to Geology course. And this is how I figured out how I could stay outdoors a lot. Because in geology, you go out into the field all the time. You're always using the field to tell you about the past as well as to help you solve problems about the present. And I fell in love with it, and I got some internships that were in the summer. So one summer, this is really summer, it's very high elevation, just like you're familiar with at Trail Ridge or places around Colorado. I went and spent time mapping the last glacier advance in the Yellowstone area. So it was so cool to live outside of Yellowstone for 5 weeks and work with my peers that were all my age. And we didn't have any connection really to the outside world, no television. The nearest phone was an old school payphone a mile away. So it was very different. And I became very close to all these folks while doing geology and realizing like that I really love science. So at Whitman, I ended up doing geology as my major. I ended up writing an honors thesis and doing some more research. I did research in southern Colorado. And then I had a plan for my graduation. And when I graduated, I was going to take 2 years off and do Peace Corps, and then come back and do a master's in geology, and then a PhD in geology. And then my way into NASA was going to be as a geologist working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, because that's where we use a lot of geologists at NASA as we think about exploring these planets. Well, guess what? Sometimes you are not in control of your plan. And the country I was going to go to, Kazakhstan, to teach English for the Peace Corps, pulled away from Russia, and they wouldn't send me to go. So while all of my friends went off to graduate school, I was left without a job. I was left without a place to go to graduate school because I hadn't applied because I'd already been accepted to Peace Corps. And I felt really lost and actually like really concerned because I am a type A person and I like to get stuff done and I charge and charge. And I suddenly felt put way back behind. And I came back home, which also didn't feel like great to me, not that I don't love home, but that I didn't want to be back with my parents. I wanted to be out being successful on my own. But I came back home, I volunteered here at Fort Collins High School. I coached with the cross-country team, so I volunteered as a coach. And as I was doing that, I realized, you know, I was going to teach English as a second language in Kazakhstan. Why don't I just teach? Like, I love teaching, I love students. So I went back to school at Central Washington University and I did my teaching certification. And I became a science teacher. And first I taught earth science to mostly 9th grade and some 10th graders. But then I created an astronomy class because, of course, I love astronomy. And it was in my astronomy class that one of my students asked the very important question that would get me back on track to becoming an astronaut. Anyone have an idea of what this very important question is? Yeah. Exactly, the most frequently asked question. How do you go to the bathroom in space? Because if you can't go to the bathroom in space, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so I was like, wow, I don't know how you go to the bathroom in space. I have an idea of how I personally would want this engineered, but I don't know if that's right. So I went to the internet, I looked it up, and in finding the answer for my student, I found the answer to my life dream, which is how to apply as a teacher to become an astronaut. Oh my gosh. But my husband is a very practical person, and he was like, you know, there's going to be a lot of very smart people that are applying to be an astronaut. And I said, yes, I totally get that. But how can I go be a teacher and tell my students to go after their big dreams if I won't even try for my own big dream? So I put myself to the very test and I filled out the application and got all the letters of recommendation and I sent it off into the void because it felt like a void because I didn't hear from NASA for at least like another 3 months. And I came back from my summer vacation and I found out they wanted me to do a physical test. And I did that test and I sent in the results. And then I finally got the call that they wanted me to be interviewed and come down to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. So I flew down to Texas for a week and they checked out my body and we did just tons of medical tests. I saw like my skeleton in the hole. I'd never seen my whole skeleton, and I had never had all sorts of like scans of all of my soft organs. And we got to do aptitude tests, and I also found out how you use the shuttle potty. So this was very important. I took this picture to take back to my students, but just so you'll have an answer, this is the shuttle answer. Later, I think over the course of the days, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the answer we use on the space station, which is really cool for the future. But for the shuttle answer, we use a hose with a funnel. Everyone gets their own personal funnel. And yes, it is kind of like a vacuum cleaner, and it sucks the urine down that tube into a tank. And the tank eventually fills, and eventually you have to like vent it out into space, and your urine becomes like space dust. And then the kind of gross part that I'm not sure why it's probably practical from the standpoint of we don't want to litter in space, but the solid goes underneath, kind of like a porta potty, only there's no fluid, of course, in it, and it has a trap door, and it has a slight vent to space where it basically freeze dries your poop, and yes, that is what happens to your poop. So it comes back with us to Earth, and I have no idea what happens to it after that. So that's how you go to the bathroom in the space shuttle. Well, eventually, when I was teaching my class, I was called by Bob Cabana, who at the time was the deputy director of the Johnson Space Center, and he asked me to be a part of the class of 2004, which I am proud to say that today, 2 of my classmates are doing a spacewalk. Randy Bresnik is the commander of the space station as we speak, and he's outside with my friend Joe Akaba, who is also a former science teacher and math teacher from Florida. So the 2 of them are right now doing a spacewalk, and I'm hoping everything is going really well. But the neat thing about this class of 2004, we called ourselves the Peacock, well, we didn't call ourselves that, but we were named the Peacock class, is that all of us got a chance to fly, and several folks have flown multiple times. We had 3 educators, Joe, Ricky, and myself. We had engineers, a Navy SEAL, Air Force pilots, doctors, and then we also were joined internationally by Aki and Satoshi and Naoko as part of the Japanese Space Agency. So it was a really great group to work with. Well, then you have to go train. I think this might make you feel better. Astronauts have to go back to school. Like, we literally don't get to just go fly in space. We personally spent about 1.5 years training, but current astronauts spend about 2 years because the space station has more systems, and also because there's a language piece that they have to learn. So anyway, we go out into the wilderness and we do survival training. This is in Maine. And we do this because, of course, we fly in our jets across the United States. And what if one of those jets crashed? How would you take care of yourself? So this is to see if we can take care of ourselves. So we made tents out of our parachutes, and we're getting water. And then we ran scenarios because, of course, if you were crashing, you'd have someone get injured. And so we ran scenarios to get people safely out of the environment. This is kind of a good way to do team building as well. As you guys are doing your team stuff today, it's good to be thrown into these situations, sometimes more practical and other times not so practical, but it helps you come together. Then we did water survival training, and I have to say this was my least favorite day in space training because you get strapped into the belly of this helicopter, and then they pull you down into the water, and then it rolls, and you have to wait till it rolls over, and then you're allowed to escape. And we didn't just do this once, which would have been just fine with me, but we had to do this 3 times, the last time with dark out goggles. So this is a reminder that not everything that you do feels comfortable. You're going to go through hard trials and things like that. And yet, if you work together as a team, like all of us were encouraging each other. I actually had to do it 4 times because the first time I got a little tangled up, and so they thought I was going to drown, so they pulled me out, and so I had to repeat it. So people encourage you along the way, and they support you, and that's really important. I hope that you realize, like, you don't always feel comfortable. But it was worth it, because then we got to practice in simulators and eventually fly in the T-34 prop plane. And this was my first time to ever fly up front in a plane, and that was really cool. So we did takeoffs and landings, well, touch and goes. Of course, we had an instructor behind us in the back seat, but this way we were getting some pilot training. And my job was never to be a pilot, but the goal was to understand, like, the task saturation. The pilot has a lot of stuff going on. How can you offload that person? How can you help be a part of the team? And also, eventually, I did get to fly and do the comm and communication and navigation. So that's really important, because it helps you learn how to task shed. You know, not every moment do you need to be like doing everything. Sometimes you have to drop things that are not as important. And so we always talk in aviation about fly the plane first. Like, are you safe? Are you on altitude or keeping your nose up so that you're not going to crash? And then the second piece is, do you know where you're going? I mean, it's great if you're like in the air, but where are you going to land? And then the third piece, they're going to talk to you, the ground, because they need to have you in communication with other planes and keep everyone safe. But you can always shed communication if emergencies happen. And I have been in a plane where we had to shut down a main engine for an emergency, and we will instead of talking to the ground and asking, we just start telling them what we're going to do because we're in an emergency situation. So we start with the prop plane, and then we graduate and we go into the T-38 jet, which goes faster than the speed of sound and is really fun to fly in, as well as a great training vehicle. And then it's time to go to the classroom as well. So we do some orbital mechanics, which talks about why it's so important to understand this 51.6 inclination and how you can't just go from any orbit to the next orbital plane. There's a lot of propellant that would need to be used, so there's a lot of dynamics that's about physics. And so we talked some about that. Of course, we talked about our spacesuit. And eventually we got into the shuttle, and I spent lots of weekend time in the shuttle just practicing and, you know, memorizing where these 1,500 switches and circuit breakers are and what they do. And I don't know about you guys, but I make tons of flashcards to study. So I had all this stuff, and we would study together too. Like because we had tests. We had written tests and we had performance tests. And you have to graduate through all those. So we'd help each other study for all of those things. And then we got to actually work in full mock-ups of the shuttle that helped us think about, when you're in those big orange launch and entry suits, what to do and how to operate in them. And then when you finally get to space, you don't have to wear those suits anymore. So then how do you put them away? Because, like, you know, I'm sure parents are always telling you, put your stuff away. And like in space, putting stuff away is not so easy. So where do you put things, and how do you change the shuttle from your launch vehicle into your operating vehicle? So we would practice in these mock-ups. We even practice in the mock-up on how to make food, which is important because, of course, if you've got to eat to go to the bathroom. So this is our galley, and the food comes in uniquely packed packets. There's freeze-dried, a lot of freeze-dried food, but there's some food that's thermally stabilized. There's cans of food, and then there's just dry food like tortillas and nuts and M&Ms. But anyway, for that, the stuff that needs to be rehydrated, it's in these packets, and there's a little tiny needle that pokes into the packet, and then the water is shot into it and therefore contained. So I'm saying all of this because as you guys go to do your experiments, you may want to think about what water does when it's not contained, if you decide to use water. Or you may want to think about, like, there's pouches or different ways that you can use stuff. So just some ideas there. All right, and then each of us had a locker for our clothing and a locker for food. That's all you got. So, you know, it's pretty, I mean, we had way more clothes than we need in space because you don't really get dirty, but that's how we operated. Eventually you graduate, and then you get to take some advanced courses in robotics because you use multiple robotic arms. This is a space shuttle's robotic arm, but I'll show you later the space station's robotic arm. And while I was done and waiting for a flight, there was some time to wait. And so we had our daughter, Cambria, who is now 10, And so this is her right as I'm beginning my spacewalk training. So she's only about 4 or 5 months old there. And so spacewalk training is another advanced piece that we do. And of course, this is in a big swimming pool. You can see the diver behind us. And it's one of my favorite pieces of training because for 6 hours, you go essentially play spacewalker and you solve problems. You're working with the team. And it's really satisfying. It's very physical. And I like being a physical person. So it was really rewarding. All right, well, finally I got the phone call. So I think it was about 6 years into having been trained and been working as an astronaut to join this crew. And there's some other Colorado connections in this crew. But first, we'll start out. Our commander was Alan Poindexter. He was a Navy pilot. He'd already flown to space and helped add a module to the space station. Then Jim Dutton went to the Air Force Academy here in Colorado. He grew up in Oregon, and he was our pilot. We had 3 engineers, Rick Mistracchio, Stephanie Wilson, and Naoko Yamazaki. And Stephanie had worked at Martin Marietta down in Denver before it became Lockheed Martin. So she'd already been out here. And then we had Clay, who I always tease because he's from Nebraska. And really, I mean, Nebraska just blows into Colorado. So. But I always tease him. But he's a physicist. So the 7 of us would be working together. All right. So I'm going to pause it just for one, or, well, I'll let this go. On April 5th of 2010, so when did I go to space camp? Were you listening? 1990. So 2010, April, I get suited up with everyone. It's about midnight, and we had sleep shifted because to get into this orbital plane, you have to hit it when it goes, that plane intersects with Florida. So it happened to be intersecting at 6 in the morning. So we had to get up at 8 at night. At about midnight, we're getting suited up. Then we walk out to this silver van. The silver van takes us all the way out to the launch pad. And what vehicle do you think this is? Oh, yes, it's a space shuttle, but it's the Space Shuttle Discovery, the very vehicle that took up the Hubble Space Telescope 20 years, almost to the day earlier. So that's why I'm telling you this. When I was sitting as a 9th grader in my classroom, 20 years later, I would be boarding the vehicle I built. Your big dreams are possible, but hopefully you heard I had mentors, teachers, parents, all of these things going on. Okay, so you see all that beautiful energy, and you saw us like bounce, right? That is the biggest kick I've ever felt in my back. And thankfully, it doesn't hurt too bad, but it sure startles you. And then the next 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes and 20 seconds, you are riding all of that energy in those white solid rockets. Yes, the main engines are burning, and yes, that fuel is important, but it's really the solid rocket fuel that's getting you altitude up, and then we'll start heading down long range. So the next 2 minutes and 20 seconds are like riding a wooden roller coaster. I don't know if Elitch's still has them, but that is where I got my early spaceflight training, is at Elitch's on the wooden roller coaster. Eventually, you'll see the solids fall back. There they go. They fall into the ocean, and they're actually recovered. And some of the pieces are able to be reused, and are maybe going to be parts of designs in future rockets. So that's pretty cool. And then it's another 6 minutes on the main engine. So that's that beautiful time lapse that you see there, where then we go and we finally reach the space. Because the next 6 minutes you go until the main engine's cut off, and you're high enough to be good for about an orbit. Not quite. You need to do a burn that will circularize your orbit and keep you safe. So that's how we get there. And then once we get there, we have to turn our space shuttle into a place to work. So you saw the payload bay doors open. Second day, this is me flying the robotic arm, and I'm grappling a longer extension that has a suite of cameras and instruments on the end. You know, after we lost the Space Shuttle Columbia, the larger NASA team came up with a way to hopefully keep people safe, and it did. It worked. We scanned all the tiles. We scanned all of the wing leading edges to look for any damage caused by the foam that came off the tank and that resulted in the loss of Columbia. So that's why we did those robotic moves. So that was 5 hours. The third day, we did a burn, and you saw the physics there, the action-reaction as we make that burn. And this is from the space station watching that burn. We do several burns that bring, if this is a space station, this is a space shuttle, it brings us up and under the space station. We do a flip that you're watching there, and then we come out in front of the vehicle, and then we do little hops that bring us into the vehicle. And so there's like a series of burns and then little pulses that bring us in, and these two huge masses dock together. So when they come together, of course, there's some clunking a little bit, but then we have loose hooks that grab onto the vehicle. So the shuttle has the hooks, and we grab on, and then we pull the two vehicles together into an interface that eventually we fly through. Or float through, I should say. So right now, they're looking to see, okay, are we in free drift? Because they don't want anyone firing engines or stuff and pulling these vehicles apart. So they've come together, and they've met. Oh, good. Everything's good. And now we are ready to go join our friends in the space station. So this was a big deal because it was the first time that there were two Japanese crew members meeting together in space. Soichi Noguchi was already on the space station, and then Naoko Yamazaki was floating in to meet him. So we were, the space station commander was Oleg Katov from Russia, and of course, Soichi, Naoko, and then there was TJ Creamer, and Misha and Sasha were the other two Russian cosmonauts, and Tracy Caldwell Dyson had just arrived as well. On the next day, Stephanie and Naoko are using the larger space arm, the one that's being repaired, like they just were repairing it this week, and then the Spacewalk Now is working on it too. This bigger space robotic arm is the space station's, and it took that module out of the back of the payload bay and docked it. You can think of that module as like a U-Haul. Essentially, we brought up 6 tons of equipment, both science, experiments, supplies, food, clothing, like all of this stuff that needed to happen and get to the space station before we retired the shuttles. And it's really fun being a space mover, so all of us got to be space movers. I think that's pretty cool. But it's kind of messy. There's lots of foam, lots of straps, but you can squeeze in and get around things. We had a series of 3 spacewalks because we brought up an ammonia tank as well. The ammonia tank is used on the outside of the space station to cool all of the equipment. Otherwise, things would overheat, and you don't want computers overheating that control the space station. So these spacewalks, they take time. We first have to have people do a pre-breathe. You saw the oxygen mask there. They purge the nitrogen out of their blood because they're going from the space station, which is like this room. It's full of air, actually a little bit higher pressure because you guys are at altitude, but at 14.7 psi. And then their space suit is pure oxygen at 4.2. So it's kind of like a reverse dive and coming from higher pressure to lower pressure. This is the ammonia tank. It is huge. It's about 2,000 pounds. And we first had to have the astronauts unbolt it and then hand it over to the robotic arm. A lot of the work that we did on the space station was coordination between robotic teams and spacewalk teams and then the ground team. So as you're working in teams, think about how maybe you can also pair and talk with other teams as well and learn from each other because you're constantly working at teams when you're at NASA and in the working field. Okay, so we took off the, well, we first took that new tank, we put it in a temporary spot, then we took the old ammonia tank and we put it on that cart that you saw like moving. It's kind of cool, it's like a little tram cart on the front of the space station. We put it there, and when I say we, Stephanie and Jim are flying the robotic arm, and Rick and Claire outside, and I'm the person inside that talks to them the whole time because I was their backup, so I knew all of the bolt turns, I knew all the things they were doing. And things were going really well until we went to put the brand new tank in. And then we had our Houston problem. Like, Houston, we do have a problem. And our problem was that we couldn't get the 4th bolt to drive. For heaven's sakes, this thing only has 4 bolts. I mean, it's really simple, right? Except for, unfortunately, the back of the tank was all metal, and metal in multiple temperatures that are seen in space and multiple extreme temperatures warps. And this warped enough where that bolt could not seat into the receptacle. So there's like a little receptacle, and the bolt was supposed to drive into it, and it wouldn't go in. So you saw we tried multiple tools, like a flathead screwdriver and jacks, even that little dinky hammer. But none of those things worked. What worked was having Rick hold the ammonia tank for 45 minutes, so it would be essentially one temperature. And then Rick and Clay is a former football player, the two of them pushed it into the space station. And that's what worked. And so sometimes brute force does make things work. Just like power cycling your computer. So sometimes it works. So this is the old tank. We got it back in, and it was able to come back down to the ground and be refurbished to be used again. Each spacewalk is about 6.5 to 8 hours. It kind of depends on what's going on and what problems you run into. But crew members are in those suits for much longer because, of course, they had to get suited up. So when they come in and we literally attach them to the wall so that we can take off all their suit pieces, they are super tired. They are like exhausted. They've only had water in a little drink bag, like a camel pack. So that may be another thing that you want to think about is how water is stored and used. And then we, of course, also do science, even as shuttle crew members. The people that live in the space station, they do science all the time. That's their job. It's a laboratory. But shuttle astronauts don't get to do a lot of science. But we helped do some, and we transferred a lot. And so here, Soichi and Naoko are transferring frozen samples of blood and urine so that folks down on the Earth can study how the human body changes in space. And there are a lot of changes. And so this has helped us make better drugs. It helps us to think about how we want to fight cancer, diabetes, a whole bunch of things. So space medicine is very important. The shuttle created water because we had fuel cells. And so my commander was filling a water bag that we transferred. But now, and I'll talk to you more about this later, now water is mostly created by people on the space station drinking today's fluids to be turned into tomorrow's fluids. So we'll talk about the water cycle on the space station. Check out this cool little simple centrifuge. All the bubbles are in the center, right, of that drink. That was like a thick applesauce drink. Yes, and we play in space. This is not recommended by Dennis. Okay, so this is important to remember how water behaves or fluids in space. This is a water droplet. That's an M&M on the inside of it. It's a very handy snack. Naoko also brought up cherry blossoms from Japan. Yeah, they're super pretty. So, you know, there are lots of cool videos on YouTube of water. Don Pettit has done a lot of demonstrations with films, like blowing bubble types of films. So there may be some stuff that you want to do over the next couple of days, like getting on YouTube and looking at these videos and thinking about how things work in space. Of course, we love to eat, and we talked a little bit about how food is prepared. So you can see those pouches. Most of us just use a spoon. It's really easy. There's a couple of folks that are really big fans of chopsticks in space too. Super easy, clean, easy. You don't really need like forks or any of the other fancy tools. This particular evening, Naoko and Soichi had prepared a Japanese meal of rehydrated shrimp and canned mackerel to make some sushi, or more like California rolls, in space. We exercise in space. And so like we were talking about earlier, this is like the resistance piece. This is very important for our long duration space flyers. They have to do it at least for about 2 hours a day. There's some other ways to work and maybe get stronger, and so people are looking at that, but 2 hours of exercise a day. You have to be very physically fit. We grow in space, which was exciting for me because my sister, who went to high school here, was a volleyball and basketball player, and I finally was taller than her for 2 weeks in space. That was awesome. Sleeping in space, pretty enjoyable. Crawl into your sleeping bag. It's not very cold, so you don't need to like have your arms inside unless you really want to feel confined. So you usually just let your arms out of these holes in the sleeping bag. We attach the pillow to our head, but you don't really need a pillow. It's just kind of there for comfort. And then everyone wears a mask because there's so much light and there's all these like blinky buttons, and so it's just nice to wear a mask. One of our favorite things is to look out at the Earth and just spend free time there. So of course, people that live in space for 6 months, they of course like watch movies and do other things. But for those of us that were just there for 2 weeks, like we just want to look at Earth because Earth is super interesting and beautiful. And we are 240 miles above the Earth's surface, so it's not really high above. We're still under the protection of the Van Allen belts, and so radiation is definitely happens to us more, but we still are protected. And of course, radiation is a big piece of as we go on, either back to the moon and do more research there, or we go on out into the solar system. That's going to be a big piece to think about. Light on Earth, so beautiful and interesting. This was across Australia, so you saw some early thunderstorms, and then it was my first time to see the aurora australis. In fact, it was my first time to see an aurora, so that was pretty cool. And I know sometimes in Colorado, my parents have seen a couple auroras come down this way, so pretty cool. But it's just the colors, the fact that you're going around the Earth every 90 minutes, so you get 45 minutes of light and 45 minutes of dark. These are very interesting things about space. And you know, it makes you like appreciate time and thinking about time management. You can be a superhero in space and move things like this. Naoko is moving with just her hands this 900-pound rack. This rack allows us to take better pictures of the Earth's surface. And it houses a camera that you guys can use. The Sally Ride Earth Cam is run out of Space Camp, and you can direct it to take photos. So if you got online and look up Sally Ride Earth Cam. Well, finally, we had unloaded everything, and then we loaded up 2 tons of trash, so we were also trash collectors. And this is our last piece of foam, which had our patch inscribed into it. And later, I'm going to talk to you more about patches. So that piece of foam, we all signed, and then we got it back into the vehicle. And then, again, Naoko and Stephanie used the robotic arm to unberth the module and put it back into the payload bay. So the clearance in the payload bay is maybe like 6 to 8 inches. So I think of it as like the most expensive game of operation. Don't mess up. So it's very cool. And then it's time for some tradition. So just like you guys have tradition in all of your schools, of course, we hang our patch, and there's all the patches of the teams that flew before us that helped build the International Space Station. It's been on orbit for 17 years plus. So the fact that all those crews helped build it, live there, do science there is pretty remarkable. And then it's time to leave. And so, of course, we said goodbye. And this time, our pilot, Jim, gets to fly. So the commander brings you in, but the pilot gets the chance to fly, and he takes you out away from the space station. Then we do a lap around the space station, and we take pictures of it, because it's also important for engineers on the ground to see what is happening to that vehicle, because things do change, and micrometeorites do hit the space station, and things get old, and so these photos are able to show them how things are changing through time. It's really important for engineers back on Earth. And we are finally almost ready to be completely away from the space station, but Soichi could still see us in his camera lens, so he told us to all float up to the window and get one last picture. It's really easy in space to float up to the window. In the simulator on Earth, it was always very crowded when we all tried to get on the flight deck. But there we are. I like this photo because we're waving goodbye, but you have kind of some nice reflections of the space station as well. So now we have actually spent 3 more days in space, but we condense it here for time's sake. To get back to Earth, we have to close up the payload bay doors, so come back into a vehicle that can land safely. Of course, we have to get back into our orange suits, which is a little bit harder in space than on Earth. And then we do a burn, and that burn is into our velocity vector, and it just slightly slows us down, just enough that we start falling and start to interact more with the Earth's atmosphere. And the Earth's atmosphere is what slows us down. And so you saw that orange glow. That is plasma. We are so hot as we come back in through the atmosphere that we saw plasma, which was actually the first time I was pretty scared for a few minutes until I just refocused back on what I needed to do. And then you just heard the 2 sonic booms. Those happen as we come back into Florida. We're pretty close now. And that's a boom off the nose and a boom off the tail. And then we are not an airplane, so we cannot relight any engines. So the commander glides us down to a landing. We were at 17,500 miles per hour just, an hour or so earlier, and now we're landing on a runway at about 200 knots. Jim put out the chute that helps slow us down, and in the earlier days of the shuttle, it also put less force on the wheels so we could use the tires for longer. So it was a good for 2 things. And then about an hour and a half or so later, we're all feeling good enough, not great, but good enough to go out and smile for the cameras and go see our families. So those were my 15 days in space. I have some outtake videos, which I think we have time for, because these are fun, for one thing, and they are also might help you think a little bit about your experiments. So from our outtakes, of course, each of us has a family. My daughter was 3 when I flew, and so she was just figuring out how to count backwards, and she wasn't very good at it yet. She would count back 5, 4, 3. She would 5, 4, 2, 3, 1. We tried really hard. Okay, you saw the sleeping, but it was pretty cool. Like, you have to connect your sleeping bag wherever you want. And I highly recommended trying out multiple places, like the ceiling. I tried out the walls. I went into the airlock. There's lots of good places to sleep. And you sleep really well because there's nothing pushing on you, so you're just floating. So it's very relaxing. Let's see, what else do we have here? I think we have our space. Oh, keeping things clean. Even in space, it's really important to keep things clean. Think about all your skin cells, your sock fuzz, your hair, all that stuff here on Earth, it just falls and someone goes and vacuums it. But in space, you have to keep that stuff cleaned up. So Clay was showing that. Yes, I am going to become a gymnast in space. Naoko did a lot of demonstrations for students in Japan, and so they had wanted her to do this tightrope walk, which was tricky, not because she was worried about falling, but because it's hard to balance it. And then I do not know why we did this, but I have an idea of who started it. But this is a camera at dinner one night. It's a fisheye camera. Hi. That's Clay. Hi. Hi. I don't know what happens in Nebraska. I have some theories. Okay, music in space is a big deal. People need pastimes. And so this is a koto. It's a miniature koto. But there's been didgeridoos and bagpipes, flutes, pianos, guitars, all sorts of instruments. So if you like music, music is an important part of the STEAM experience, and astronauts like music as well. So she played the koto, and you saw her fan dance. And then the Astros were, of course, our home team, so we had to do a little baseball playing, which does make it fun. I think games in space in the future will be really fun. And also, I just want to point out that no payloads were hurt in the making of this video. So, we had fun as well, which I think is important. And then we come back and we share our experiences with all of the people that helped train us. So these are the people that flew our airplanes, that trained us, that supported us, and that's the big team of NASA, which is super important. We just are the representatives, but the big team is what gets stuff done. Okay, so at this point, this is my question slide, but this is a little lambkin that went to space with me. And of course, I had, Lucasen sent me up with a bumper sticker for cross country. All right, so that is my 15 days in space and how I got to become an astronaut. And throughout the time, I don't know if we have time now, because I think we're going to go into lunch.
No, we've got a little time.
Okay.
Some questions.
Yeah, we can do some questions while you're thinking of them right now. Yeah.
How did Mr. Lucasen look back then? Did he have like a mustache? Because in
No, Lucky didn't have a mustache when we were. He still is driving the
Yeah.
FOD. Is he still driving the FOD? Yes, good. That's a Ford, but the one of the letters fell off. And so for cross country, he would bring that out and always have water in the back. So, yep, still worked. Yes?
Did y'all have to do any training for like G-force?
Do we do G-force training? Yes, we do. It's not a lot of G's that we pull coming home or launching. On launch, the most that we pull is 3 through our chest, so it feels uncomfortable. To kind of just get an idea of what it's going to feel like, we go to Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, and we get into a centrifuge, and they do, whirl you around, and it just feels uncomfortable. It feels like someone really heavy is sitting on you and making it really hard to breathe, and it's hard for your arm to reach switches, but it can. And as a mission specialist too, which is the person right behind the commander and pilot, I have a swizzle stick. So I have this stick that I can use to also grab switches and circuit breakers if I needed to throw something. So that helps us. So we did that. And then you pull about 2 on re-entry, which feels like a lot when you're coming back home. But 2 is nothing. You guys do that in roller coasters and stuff like that. So we pull more G's, and we do more talk of that training, like forcing the blood from your legs up into your brain when we fly in the T-38, because we can pull up to 5 G's in the T-38 as we do a break in the landing pattern, which is fun. So, yeah. Yes?
So obviously when you're in space you get taller because there's not gravity affecting you. Does it hurt walking around on Earth after?
Some people do say like they have like more tight feelings as their backbones are settling along the spine. Thankfully, I didn't feel that part. I just felt sick, so I threw up a couple of times because for whatever reason, my neurovestibular system did not like that provocative piece of coming back into gravity. Yes?
So why specifically teachers as astronaut candidates?
Yes, so the teachers were hired, part of coming out of Krista McAuliffe, who was part of the Challenger team that we lost in 1986. And so Krista was going to fly and do some experiments in space and then go back to teaching. She had a brief training, which is 6 months with her crew. But because of the loss of Krista and this bigger program, which had been the Teachers from Space, there was interest. There's public interest because everyone has a teacher, right? Everyone knows a teacher. But you may not know all the other jobs that are done at NASA. And so the big piece was to connect with the general public and to see that this machine that we had built was really useful and it could be used by different people. So that brought interest, and it created this big team of teachers that had applied or had been a part of creating experiments. And then, of course, we lost that crew, and people were very hesitant to send anyone to space that wasn't trained and hadn't signed up, maybe understanding and training for all the risks. So Krista's backup was Barbara Morgan, and eventually in 1998, NASA asked Barbara Morgan to come back and do training. So Barbara was part of the class of 1998, and she trained as a full astronaut and flew on STS-118. And through Barbara and work with Congress, they decided that it was important to have more teachers. And as we're talking about this next year on the space station, there's going to be 2 teachers on board. And so you can follow the hashtag #TeacherOnBoard. But like I said, Joe's up there right now. And the goal is that we can communicate, because teachers have all these networks, and get information back to our science and math and technology teams so that you guys are ready for the future. So Joe's doing some specific experiments, but mostly just doing the life of an astronaut on board the space station. And Ricky Arnold will be back up in the spring. And so following along, there's a whole website and all the science that's going on. That's the same place that I may direct you in the next few days for videos, because there's so many good space videos with different astronauts, and it's important, I think, for you to connect with all those folks. Whoops, I'm hitting something, I guess. So that's why teachers. Yeah. How does artificial gravity work? So I have to say, there's never any artificial gravity. In fact, there's really not zero gravity. Always, as you learn about in physics, there's always going to be attraction between masses because they have mass. And so they are attracted to each other. In our case, we have microgravity because we're essentially falling around the Earth. And ways that we can simulate like Earth's gravity in space for people that, that are living up there for a long time is through this resistive exercises. And we don't do a centrifuge on the space station, but essentially you can, like we do for like smaller experiments, like for if you want to separate blood or things like that, you have a smaller way of doing that. So we can't do it for the people, but when you watch these new sci-fi movies, you've seen like the big wheel. And the idea is that as you, just like that juice bag that my friend Suichi was spinning, as you spin it, you create the force outward, which then feels like maybe, depending on how fast, it feels like Earth's gravity. So we don't do that yet, but for experiments, there's the possibility to do it. Yeah.
So how much do, like, for example, someone who spent 6 months in microgravity, how much do their muscles deteriorate?
So not a lot anymore. Okay. Yeah, so, but there's still stuff that changes to your body. So from the very beginning, all astronauts, no matter how long you fly in space, are going to have a change with your heart because your heart immediately says, whoa, your pump is putting too much blood in my brain and I don't need it, because here on Earth, our heart has to pump blood from our toes up to our head, and it's always working against this gravitational force. But in space, you don't need that. So right away, your body's like, okay, well, I don't need this much blood going to my brain, so I'm going to lose some of that. And so you do actually have volume loss in your body. And that part is it takes some time to recover. Just like if you donate blood, it takes time to recover because your kidneys will filter out and you'll essentially urinate some of that volume of water out. So everyone has that happen. And then muscles, unless you're using them, they start to atrophy. And so we cannot have these huge leg muscles and your big butt muscle atrophying. We need these things as we come back in. And of course, you're going to want them back on Earth. And you're going to want them if we go to the moon. You're going to want them on Mars because even though it's less gravity, it's still gravity. So you got to work out your muscles. And bones deteriorate because your body doesn't have that load on them. And without the load, they start to get absorbed back in. And so it's essentially like having osteoporosis. And so it's important to put the muscle load on the bone, which then keeps the bone strong. And we're pretty good about the bone. There is still bone loss. It's not perfect. But people are very motivated to work out. The equipment that people have built is really awesome. It's big, though. You saw how big it was. So now the engineering challenge is to find something that can be smaller and go in a capsule into deeper space. Or maybe you rendezvous with your service module and it still has a big piece. So there's ways to engineer these things. Yeah.
Did your shell team have any interaction with the team who is living long term on the International Space Station?
Well, we got to, of course, work with them for the days that we were docked. So we were docked for 11 days. But other than that, we only had one phone call that connected the larger team. So I had never met Misha and Sasha, and I had only met Oleg Kotov briefly in one of his trainings. So the important piece is that astronauts are kind of flexible. Like we're good at being team members, and we have personalities that try to get along with lots of people, while still being able to operate if there's emergencies, so being able to be a leader, but also knowing when to follow.
Is there a chance that you'll be going back into space?
No, I will not be going back to space because I retired in 2014. So I'm retired from NASA, and I now live in Washington State. Now, the cool thing for you guys is that there are going to be more options in the future for going to space because there's companies like here in Colorado, of course, there's Sierra Nevada, but up where I am in Washington, there's Blue Origin, and there's SpaceX, and there's all these new companies that are going to be sending people to space. I don't have a lot of money, so I'm probably not going to be traveling on one of those vehicles, but maybe you guys will. Yes? Is there a language barrier? This is that piece of why people train even longer, and I had a chance to do Russian language training, but There's not a huge barrier because Russians speak English very well. They've been doing it since they were young in school. And Russian is a hard language. We have to have some proficiency. We take classes, and the folks that live on the space station have to be at an intermediate high level that's tested by an international type of test. And so we go to school for language training. I lived with a family for 5 weeks and spoke Russian for most of the time. It's pretty cool. But in any situation, you're going to use, like we kind of joke, like Runglish, but like you're going to use gestures and things. If you can't get the exact meaning across, you're going to look for ways to get the meaning across. Yeah. Yes?
Is it harder to like swallow and stuff like that because your body like?
Yeah, this is a cool question. So there are pumps called peristaltic pumps, and they are essentially how your body works, which is a motion to move a fluid. And so these pumps, they squeeze around and they squeeze a fluid onward. And that's kind of what your body does, is it moves things down the esophagus into the stomach. That being said, it's still like people's body parts sometimes extend and they don't notice it, because here on Earth, if your bladder is full, and you notice it, obviously, and you feel that pressure. But in space, it kind of just floats in with all the other organs, and it can extend out, and you might not notice. It doesn't have that same sensation. And so it's very important when we talk about like doing the things that you do on Earth so that you stay healthy in space. So drinking plenty of fluid. You're not really all that thirsty because you don't really get that sensation of thirst unless you're getting like a headache. But like, keep drinking fluids, making sure all this food is stuff that really stops you up. Like, it's like camping food, and I don't know how many of you camp, but like, it is dehydrating your body, which makes it harder to go to the bathroom. And so it's important to like keep the fluids in there, and maybe even add some like fiber and stuff like that to it. So yeah, so they take that into consideration. Like they send up Metamucil with people so that they will keep things regular, because that would be like the worst thing, right? That your space experience is bad because of your interior plumbing. Yes?
Acid reflux ever a problem?
Is what?
Acid reflux?
Oh, acid reflux. Ooh, I haven't heard of it like for folks that have experienced it differently on Earth. Yeah. I didn't experience it, so that's good, I think, yeah. The only weird thing that, that was kind of a funny like eating / biology story, my friend Clay, as you can see, has a lot of fun when he's in space. He's really fun to be with. Clay and I had made egg burritos for breakfast, so we had just like a tortilla, and we rehydrate eggs, and so we put them on our burrito, and I had just kind of like floated it there because it's towards the end of the mission. I was getting pretty good about if you stabilize something, it'll stay right there. And I went to get something, and I had put hot sauce on it, and accidentally, I think Clay kind of bumped it, and the egg shot into my face with the hot sauce. And that hot sauce burned so bad. But no one's going to tell NASA about that, because we don't want hot sauce to go away on the space station. We need those flavors and like the salt. So you just have to be careful. Things happen just like they happen on Earth, and you know, some extra tears, and it got better. Yes?
How close is NASA to getting to Mars?
How close are we to getting to Mars? You know, we have a lot of big steps that are completed. And then there's some bigger challenges, and a lot of those challenges come in the way of funding. Because if you have a lot of money, then you're able to build and test a lot more at a time. So example is in the Apollo days, of every tax dollar, a nickel was essentially going to that Apollo program. Now, of $1 of tax dollars, less than half of a cent is going to the program. And so you can imagine, if you have more nickels, you are going to build faster, and it's just going to be easier. You can have a huge team of people doing it all. And now with less than half a pennies, it's pretty hard to get everything done. That being said, a lot of great stuff is getting done. And we'll talk some more about some of those pieces. Yeah. Okay, how about this is our last question, and then I got to make sure you guys eat. Oh, they have something, okay. Oh, yes. I don't remember the exact times, but the one that we ran into problems ended up getting a bit longer than it was planned to, and we had to completely change the third spacewalk. So I actually mean the people on the ground, wrote a completely brand new spacewalk and sent it up to us. Then we reviewed it to make sure that we knew what we were doing, and then they executed it. And that's when I come in handy, because I have that new script, essentially, like it's a new play. And even though Clay and Rick are super smart and they looked at the whole spacewalk, it's hard to memorize everything before you go do it. And so then I'm the one that's there making sure they know exactly what to do. And the reason why it ran long is because ammonia is poisonous to the human body. And so as they struggled with that ammonia tank, one of our next steps was to connect the connectors of the plumbing to hook the tank to the larger plumbing system that moved the ammonia through the space station. And you cannot make those connections after 4 hours into the spacewalk. And the reason why is because ammonia is white, super toxic to people, and guess what? The spacesuit is white too, and so it would not show up on the spacesuit. We know that if you're out in space for less than 4 hours and you've got ammonia on you, due to both the sunshine and because there isn't other molecules, and so it will eventually kind of, it'll essentially sublimate and become part of space dust. We know there's enough time that you won't bring it back into the vehicle. But 4 hours in, we don't know. And so that is why we had to kind of like think on the go. We talked back and forth, and we decided, we're going to change this third spacewalk, and we're not going to attach these ammonia, because we can't keep those guys out there any longer. It's already been past 4 hours. So it's real-time problem solving, right? Like just like when you guys are building your towers, you have to do work in real time, and sometimes things don't go right, and it didn't go right, and then you come back and you work again, and you make it better. Yes?
Are these suits white for visibility purposes?
Well, no, they're white because of actually the way that they need to cool and operate. Yeah. You guys, these are great questions. I'll be, of course, around the next 3 days and floating in and out. Not literally, though. Darn.
I wish we could make that happen.
I know. Let's do that.
Let's give Dottie a round of applause, please.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.